Hello, folks. Welcome. We're on our sixth session now, and we are going to be talking about putting together a protocol for implementing our surveys that we created during session 5. So our Building Community Conservation Success Social Science workshop continues to roll along. This is, of course, our 6th in a series of 11. I hope you all are enjoying this series as much as we are in making it. So without any further ado, we'll be going through today about how to go about implementing a survey, all the things that go into it, things to be mindful of. We'll be touching back on a few things that we've talked about already and proceeding along. So without any further ado, let's share a screen and go over to our PowerPoint. And this is, as I said, session 6 on survey protocol. I am quite passionate about rhino conservation, so this was my favorite of our title slides. So we're talking about creating survey protocols for how to implement. We are on week 6, session 6 of our training program, our Building Community Conservation Success Social Science Workshop. Next week, we'll be talking about expanding protocols, data management, and a bunch of other things. And then we'll get into 2 sessions of data analysis, actually 3 sessions of data analysis, excuse me, and then an implementation plan section. So we are rounding the bend here. This is our halfway mark. So kudos to you for sticking with it. And I hope this is leading you to big things and great innovations in your own research. All right, so today we're going to finish up a little bit and revisit the discussions about how to put together a survey and how to improve it, because we will use that as a beginning point to launch into how do we conduct it. And after we put that stuff together, we're going to talk about sampling, because sampling is incredibly important if you want to try to take a subset of your population, which is our survey audience, and be able to estimate how accurate they are relative to the rest of their community, at least in terms of their opinions. So how representative is our survey sample? And then we'll talk about and create a sampling protocol that maximizes representativeness, and then create a protocol for yourself and iterate it with your colleagues. So today's all about implementing it, taking the survey and putting the rubber to the road. So let's keep going. We want to become polar bears here. And so let's talk a little bit about how we are going to do our surveys, or our polls, as they're sometimes called in different places. So when we were talking about questions, we kept emphasizing 2 main factors, as well as a third one that's also important, but 2 main factors. How well does the question, the item that you are putting together, address the research topic? Second is that item absolutely necessary for answering that research question, or is it just helpful? Being able to define the need to know questions and identify all of the need to know questions versus the nice to know things is an important part of putting together a well-reasoned survey. At the end of our session 5 last time, we spoke quite a bit about how we need to not just create the questions and then choose from them the best ones, but we need to also make certain that we are answering the whole of our research question with the items that we include on our survey. Because during our exercise last session, during session 5 on crafting a survey, you might have created some great questions, but were they all of the great questions or all of the great items that you needed to be able to have to be able to answer and address the fullness of your research question? So is it a need to know question, or is it just nice to know? And is it all of the things that you need to know to answer the larger research question? All right, so let's make certain that those need to know items are on your survey. The nice to know items, let's set those aside. Things for maybe a future study. Okay, last thing, third thing that we need to keep in mind here in terms of content we're going to go through a series of different aspects of our surveys that we need to keep in mind, of course, just as reminders, is do respondents have the necessary information that they need to be able to answer the items, to be able to respond to the items in your survey? Make certain that you're asking the right subject pool, group of people that you're talking to, for that question. So if a person is not a farmer, but you're asking them questions about whether they are a farmer, they do not have the necessary information because they are not farmers. So we need to make certain that the people that we're talking to are the right people that we want to talk to, and that they know all of what they would need to know in order to be able to answer that item truthfully and completely and accurately. Okay, next. This is again a reminder from last time. We want to ideally make the surveys as short as possible. When we use that need to know approach, we will help keep the surveys short. And shorter surveys are usually going to be more effectively answered surveys. Let me say that again. Shorter surveys are going to be more effectively and correctly answered surveys. The reason is, as you may know from having gone through surveys yourself, or if you're working in areas where there's a lot of what we call survey fatigue, where people have been surveyed repeatedly, is that the less you ask of them in terms of their time, their emotional energy, their intellectual energy for your surveys, the more likely it is that you will get accurate data, and this is an important one, that they will answer the whole of your survey, not just the first couple questions and then get tired of it. Okay, keep them as short as you can. Or if you need to have a very long survey, make certain that it is a setting where you are compensating people appropriately, giving them incentives like a cold drink or some food or snacks or something like that, something that they would value. All right. Remember as well, we had two question types, our quantitative and our qualitative. Okay, here's a little quiz for you. What are some quantitative type questions? We had at least 6 types that we spoke about last time. What were they? So some of them include dichotomous, they were the rankings, the ratings scales, the Likert scales, multiple choice, check boxes, lots and lots of things. In addition to that, we had our qualitative or our open-ended questions, and that's what the whole of the qualitative questions were. Remember, we talked about trying to focus the open-ended questions answers so that they would respond with information to that item in a way that is informative for our research question. Okay, always good to keep these things in mind, especially when you're designing the survey protocol, because these components on this slide and on the previous slide, these considerations will help us identify the best survey protocol. Okay, so similarly, remember that there are many ways to ask a question. Here are all of our approaches to asking questions. We talked about, oh, actually, I forgot retrospective, pre and post as well. So we have 7 different close-ended or quantitative questions, things that have numbers associated with them. And the one main one, which are our open-ended or qualitative data. And then in addition, what we can call our nonverbal qualitative data, which I think Alex addressed during session 4 when she was talking about alternatives to surveys. So that sitting back and doing passive observation of a community of people, watching how they work, what they buy, what they frequent, how much time they spend with different items or panels or experiences, whatever it is that we're looking at. All of these are nonverbal qualitative, all right? Or can be. Okay, so remember that there are multiple ways to ask a question, and make certain that the question format that you use is the best one for that item, that thing that you want to know. Right, during our survey experience last week or last session, when we were trying to create examples of each of these kinds of items, there are the same information that we could have asked as dichotomous or a ranking scale, a Likert scale. We could have asked the same kind of question throughout all of these different quantitative or even open-ended and qualitative. So make certain that you have the proper format, the best format for your item to answer the research question that you're trying to answer, or the aspect of the research question that you're trying to answer. All right? So we're speaking now more theoretical than we have been last week. So this will get very real and very applied very shortly. So don't worry about that. Okay, remember we talked about having a relative number of quantitative versus qualitative questions. For me, I usually have about 80% quantitative and 20% qualitative, open-ended. But you may be differentially oriented. I like this ratio. It works out well from my experience and my research skill set. You can use a different approach. Alex probably has a very different general rule as well than I do. It's all good. Stick with what works for you in a way that answers your research question in the best way for you and for your community. Okay, and then we talked a little bit about ordering our surveys, which I won't spend too much time on, but think about trying to, from my perspective, starting with the easier questions to answer, which are often more quantitative questions, dichotomous, ratings, checkboxes, scales, multiple choice, what have you. Those are easier questions to answer than the open-ended ones where people have to give more of themselves and answer in an open-ended fashion. Then you can ask the qualitative questions, the open-ended questions, as a follow-up. Okay. Also, I think I said this last time, but I may not have emphasized it, that I often have would you like to add anything else with relationship to what we've discussed so far today? Because sometimes people will want to say something or speak to something that is not exactly relevant to the items that you've asked of them earlier, but might be relevant to your larger research question. So if you provide that openness, it provides people an opportunity to be able to share that perspective. And that is good. Okay. So we talked also last time with some challenges with how to make the survey more engaging and clear. Best thing is, in general, simplify the language. Make it clear and instructive and direct. And this is clear and instructive and direct from your perspective as the administrator of those surveys. Make certain that you are clear and unambiguous with what you mean, right? If you have a piece of paper and you're hoping for people to fill out that survey on that piece of paper, make it very clear when you're holding up the piece of paper, I would like you to fill out these things with this pencil by circling the best choices, right? Or checking the best check boxes, whatever it is. So make the instructions very clear and simple. And last time we talked about trying to avoid asking double-barreled questions, which are two questions when we're rolling it into one. Our example for that was exercise and eating healthy are important to me. That's a double-barreled question because you should separate the exercise and the eating healthy as being two separate questions rather than a double-barreled single question. Right? Make certain that you are asking one question within each item. Similarly, we want to try to avoid leading questions where we're trying to maybe subconsciously, maybe intentionally, it depends on what our motivation is, lead the respondent to answer in a way that we want them to. Right? There was that leading question about we are applying for a National Education Award that we would really like to win. How was your experience today? That's a leading question, right? Because you're trying to front load. Oh, we're up for this education award, and you could help us, because most people want to help people. Similarly, try to avoid double negatives in a survey. That can be problematic. I almost never. Those kinds of questions are not the best ones to include, right? So Try to not include any double negatives. I think that was said correctly. Right, so there's an example of how you can see when you use lots of negatives in a sentence, it gets confusing. So be clear, make it straightforward. Try to avoid jargon in your items too. Avoid research question, heavy jargon questions. Make it very clear in a language that people who you're going to speak to would understand. If you're asking a research question or items, and your research question is focused on a researcher, you could be more jargonistic because they will understand what that jargon, that shorthand that is more technical words means. And it's more clear for them. But if you're speaking to a community of people who are not a part of your research group, it's best to avoid very technical terms. Say what those technical terms mean instead. Okay? Similarly, avoid vague language. Be direct and clear. One of the best ways to make certain that you have simplified your language, have clear instructions, have avoided all these double-barreled leading questions, double negatives, jargons, and vague language problems is to have someone else, especially a person from the community that you're hoping to survey, read it and review your survey for clarity. Because that way, those people from that community will be most representative of the kinds of things that you need to address. So language levels, cultural differences, gender differences, what have you. Amount of time that people have, they might be able to tell you, oh, this is far too long for a normal person working in the field to be able to answer. So there's lots of value to that. In addition, before you're actually collecting your real data, do a pilot test. And we're going to talk about pilot testing here with this research protocol a little later on today. Do a pilot test of your survey. Give the survey to a person after you've had others review it for clarity and avoiding all of these complications in language that are on the slide as well. So once you have others review it for clarity, pilot test it. Take it out, maybe have 20 people in a community that you're interested in working in actually do it. Actually fill out and complete the survey. Either give it to them verbally or give it to them in a print form so that they can write it out. Pilot testing is super helpful. I can guarantee the first pilot test that you do, you will be committed to pilot testing going forward. You'll become addicted to pilot testing because it reveals so many problems that we're not aware of otherwise. Okay, so always ask other people for help, for suggestions, and then pilot test, and that does both. Okay, so if you've done those things and you've created a survey that's clear and simple, has great instructions on how to fill it out, congratulations. Because now you have a survey that has items that address the whole of what you need to be able to know to answer your research question. That is worth celebrating. For me, once we get to that point after pilot testing, I think it's always a time to raise a drink, raise a glass, and toast to ourselves and our efforts and our community and the people that we're working with. I toast everybody. It gives you lots of opportunities for drinks. So it's good for that. Anyway, congratulations. You now have a survey. That's fantastic. All right. So from now on, we have our survey in hand. We've gone through all of what we talked about in last session, in session 5. And we've also done all of the things, the extra things that we've talked about today. Right? So our survey is written. We feel really confident with that survey. We've identified the audience, the people that we want to survey, the participant pool, as we'll get into in a little bit. Now, let's talk a little bit about what you actually talk to people. When you begin speaking to people, what are some good practices going forward? This is one I like a lot. This is sort of a template that I use quite a bit when I am putting together what I call an intro script. So an intro script is something that I almost always have written out for my own purposes on a small piece of paper that I keep on my clipboard. I use clipboards all the time for doing surveys in the field. At the top of it, on a separate piece of paper from the survey itself. And on that intro script, it's just to keep things clear in my mind. and so that the hardest things are accomplished already. And for giving surveys or giving a talk, what is the hardest part of both of those things, aside from writing the thing and knowing the material and all of that? For me, and I think for many people, the hardest thing about giving a survey or giving a talk is the first sentence, the very beginning. When I go up to a person, what am I going to say? So if I have an intro script in hand that I have pretty well memorized, but until then I have it available, and in case I forget, I have it available after I have memorized it. If I have that intro script, it makes it so much easier to be able to do the survey. So this is one possibility that works well for me. Excuse me, Miss, Sir. My name is Dr. James Danoff-Burg, and I am from the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens in Palm Desert, California in the USA. We're interested in knowing about what your community thinks about human-wildlife conflict, specifically with respect to elephants. Would you mind taking 5 minutes to share your thoughts on these 10 questions that I have in the survey about this topic? You can stop whenever you want, and I almost always say, and your responses will be kept confidential or anonymous, meaning that your name will not be associated with your answers. That's my intro script. I usually have that written out in front of me, and you can see that it does several things. It introduces yourself to them, tells you where you're from, is very clear and starts to establish that bond and that social contract of saying, this is what we're interested in knowing, establishing how long you're asking of them, 5 minutes, 10 questions, and letting people know that they can stop whenever they want, and that we will keep their name and any identifying information separate from the surveys. We'll keep it confidential, and the surveys will be anonymized. That last point, confidentiality and anonymity, are very important because sometimes people will be more open and more direct and more forthcoming with what they really feel about something if they know and can trust you, if they know that you are not going to possibly get them in trouble for their answers. So if we are very clear and we have the survey in front of us, and we say, we have these many questions. You can see I'm not going to write your name on the top. I'm only going to have some identifying information about where you are and maybe a first name that I ask you to give me. They could give you their real first name. They could give you a different first name. It doesn't much matter from our perspective because what we need to know is just having some sort of a name that we could reference and say, oh, this woman answered this way. That's all we need to know. Right? So that's the best practice for going forward. We want to be able to keep their information confidential and anonymous and protect them so that there are no repercussions, no impacts on them from participating with us. Make sense? Okay, so what I'd like you to do is write down this intro script, if you've not already. You may have already, or maybe you've taken a screenshot of this. Either way, write down this intro script. Feel free to change it as much as you would like. Try to keep those main parts in it though, about introducing you, introducing what you want to know. You may want to say why you want to know it, although it's best not to say why, because that could bias their responses. But if people ask you, why do you want to know this? You should have an answer in hand, even if you don't have it as part of your intro script. Tell them how long the survey is, how long it will typically take them to fill it out, to complete it, whether it's verbal or written. And make certain that you tell them that they can stop whenever they want and that your responses will be confidential and or anonymous. You choose which it is that you're going to use. Make sense? So take a minute now, pause the screen in a moment, and write down your own intro script that you will use for the survey that we've just created during session 5. All right, pause. pause the video now and we'll rejoin it in a moment. Okay, so you have the intro script. Hopefully that provides a little bit of comfort to you. If you're like me, one of the people that likes to have the first couple sentences written out, that is a tool at your disposal on your clipboard always. Okay, so now we have the survey, we have our first statement, the intro script. Now what we want to think about is how we act when we are talking to them. Because different people will expect different kinds of behavior, dress, cultural aspects, cultural sensitivities, a variety of things based on where you are. So when you're coming into the community and starting to put together your protocol for your research, think of your audience. What is appropriate for the people that you're going to speak with? Okay, here's an example. If we were in California, the state that I am in and live in now, and we were out on the beach, most everyone is wearing beach wear, bathing suits and such, and bikinis and so on. And if I were out there in a suit with a coat and a tie, I would not be dressed appropriately. Most people would think I was a crazy person and probably would not want to talk to me because it's hot. I'm close to the water. I'm wearing very nice clothes. Why am I doing that close to the water in the sandy area? So you could think of other examples that are more appropriate for the communities in which you may work. Maybe you come into an area and you are underdressed. So you have cut off shorts where they were pants, and you cut the bottoms of the legs off and they're fraying. The fabrics, threads are all sticking out. You're wearing really rundown shoes and maybe a stained t-shirt. Maybe you're not shaved, or your hair is all messed up, or you're not made up appropriately. We need to be able to make certain that we are appropriate for the audience that we're going to talk to. Almost always, I don't want to look exactly like the audience that I'm going to talk to. I want to be a little better dressed, because people like to, or rather are more willing to defer to and give you more information if you are a little bit better put together. If you're dressed better, if your makeup is nice, if your hair is well groomed, if you're shaved, those kinds of things matter. Right? We size up our people that we're speaking to very quickly. And you want to make certain that you look nice. You're not overdressed, but you're definitely not underdressed. Okay. Similarly, you might want to think about how funny or serious your audience is. If they tend to be very serious people, you should not come in being very funny and jokey. Right? You should be respectful of the community locally. You should be knowledgeable about their knowledge, about the attitudes that the people may have about your survey and the survey content or the research goal, and what sorts of behaviors are appropriate. Right? So this is a different sort of knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors. And similarly, think about other culturally sensitive things. If you're working, say, in a primarily Muslim area, and veils are more normative for women, then women surveyors should wear a veil as well. We want to be respectful of the cultural sensitivity if that's the appropriate thing for guests of that village to wear. You know this better than I for your communities. So think of your audience, think what's normal there, and dress similarly. Maybe a little nicer than similarly. Okay? Also, last time we talked about limitations on self-reporting. We talked about how sometimes people tell you more than they really do know, that some people might think that they know more than what they really do, that their memories may be flawed, that there may be biases that they introduce because, as I just said a second ago, they want to tell the interviewer what they think the interviewer would want to hear, right? So ideally, when we're interviewing people with these surveys, we are asking them for their truth, for the information, for the feelings, for the thoughts, for the knowledge that they really have. And so we'd like to be able to avoid these 4 limitations on self-reporting. Self-reporting is information where people tell you themselves. So ideally, we'll be able to come up with approaches that help to restrict the accuracy of your data through these limitations on self-reporting and self-report data. So how to solve these? Well, we've got some best practices for going about along those lines. Right? First off, like I was saying earlier on the last slide, dress well, present yourself well. There are also these other 5 groups of ideas that I call the conducting core concepts, because sometimes it's nice to have a little acronym, CCC. So for conducting interviews, these are some core concepts that I think are particularly useful. Right? First, and I'll go through each of these 5 in sequence. Be appreciative of people's time. They're spending time. Be appreciative of it. We've talked about this quite a bit. Separation, we want to make certain that we are not trying to be too friendly, too buddy-buddy, inappropriately so. So we want to separate ourselves from them to be a neutral observer of the community and their perspectives. Third, we want to be able to be objective. We don't want to get too tied into the community, and being that objectivity really helps us do better science. Fourth, we want to be consistent from house to house to house, from person to person to person, and importantly, from interviewer to other interviewer to other interviewer. If you have multiple people who are involved in doing the interviews, we want to have consistency across all of the interviewers, all the surveyors. We'll talk about that in a second too. Fifth, we want to have the appropriate surveyors, the appropriate interviewers out there doing the surveys. Make certain that they're age appropriate, that they're gender appropriate, that they are ethnically appropriate if that's an issue or an important thing for the community in which you're working. Okay, we'll go through each of these in turn. So as we've said before, we should be appreciative for anyone who is willing to take the time, even if it's only 5 minutes, to talk to us and give us their perceptions, their opinions, their thoughts, their knowledge, because they're doing you a favor. They're taking time out of their day that they could otherwise be doing something that is more valuable to them than telling you what you want to know. And like I said earlier, especially in areas where there is survey fatigue, where people have been surveyed on and on and on many, many times. And that may be a real problem in the communities in which you're working. So be very grateful, be very appreciative, be brief, be professional. If it's a long survey, as we've said already, make certain that you have an appropriate incentive to reward them for their time. A cold drink, some food, snacks, what have you. Maybe a little gift, a sticker or a pen or something that has the name of your organization on it, something. Be appreciative. A thank you gets so much. And an appreciative attitude is many thank yous. Okay. Second, we don't want to be necessarily of the community. We don't want to be necessarily identified with the community. We don't necessarily want to be certainly identified as an enemy of the community, of the people in the enemy. But being too friendly can also bias the data as well. So we want to be not their friend, but also definitely not their enemy, because both will influence the respondents. We want to be friendly, but not their friend. Make sense? So we want to be respectful with our body position. Ideally, good posture really helps quite a bit. Keeping an appropriate distance from people, not getting too close and being too friendly, too much in their face. I guess being on video is similar to doing an interview. We don't want to be too close to the video camera. So maintain the appropriate distance between yourself and the respondent and the participant. Okay. Third, we want to be a blank slate. This is kind of a follow-up to that last one of being not their friend, not their enemy. But we want to be objective. We want to be a gray slate like our surveyor on the screen, where people can tell you things and you don't wince, or, oh, wow, that's fast. Oh, yes, right? Because both of those are going to lead to biased results. If they tell you something and you find it shocking and you do that, are they going to keep telling you things? The truth? No, probably not, right? If you are too friendly, oh, really? Oh, that's fascinating. Oh, really? Oh. You're going to encourage them to continue that that train of thought when it may not be appropriate for them. So we want to be a blank slate. Neutral face, neutral eye contact. And what I mean by that is this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As opposed to, or those last two, not neutral eye contact, right? Shock is not neutral eye contact. So just be receptive. I usually say thank you at the end of some, if not all, responses, or just a mm-hmm. Those work well too. Just to acknowledge that you were listening is helpful as well. Active listening, this is called. So active listening is very helpful. A thank you and mm-hmm, I see. Okay. All of those things would be acceptable. Not like, oh, that's fascinating. That is not neutral, right? So make certain that you are thankful, but you are not really encouraging them one way or the other. Also, sometimes people pause when they're thinking and putting together responses in their mind. So there might be a long pause where they stop at the middle or even the end of the sentence and they're looking up in the sky and they're clearly actively thinking. And in those cases where you're not certain whether they are done, before you ask the next question, it's always helpful to say, is there more that you would like to add to that? Is there anything else that you would like to add? I see. Would you like to share anything else on that topic? Any of those things would work very well. Right? So ask them if they are through, and don't ask them if they are through by saying, are you through? Ask them for more if they have more, right? Because asking them if they're through is encouraging them to stop talking. And maybe they're just thinking. Hopefully that difference is clear, right? So, do you have anything else that you'd like to share on that topic? No, I think I'm good, thank you. That's how that would typically play out. Okay, objectivity, very helpful. Similarly, typically when we are doing research studies, it's almost never just one person doing the surveys. So we'll have multiple interviewers. And we want to make certain that all of our interviewers, all of our ducks, are all in a row. This is a saying that we say in the US quite a bit. We put our ducks in a row. And one of the ways that we can put our ducks in a row is by standardizing our protocol. When you have multiple interviewers, it is really helpful to have a script for the entire survey that the surveyor ideally memorizes or memorizes nearly precisely, but maybe changes slightly, but is close to word for word and identical as every other interviewer uses as is possible. Because when we have a word for word script, there will be great consistency among all of the participants' responses across all the interviewers as well. If everyone acts a similar way, sits up, has neutral eye contact, I see. Thank you. Responds the same way, says the same thing when they're phrasing the question, doesn't elaborate more than is really appropriate. Sometimes people need to have things explained to them, and that's fine, because what we may think is not jargon might be jargon after all. So be prepared to explain, but ideally we have a word-for-word script, something that we can use, and again, sort of a tool on our clipboard that we have in front of us that we can ask them clearly so that interviewer to interviewer, they will be asking all of the participants the same questions in very, very similar ways, if not identical. Okay. Similarly, along the lines of standardizing our protocol, ideally, you're standardizing where the surveys are done as well. So if we are doing some surveys in home and some out on the street, and in the home we're sitting down and we're talking to people, and out on the street we're walking down the street and maybe we're following behind them, or they stop and talk to us while there's all these other people walking around. Those are very different conditions for doing a survey. If you're relaxed and in your own home, people aren't walking by who you don't know, ideally. You're relaxed, you're in your own zone, you're in your own dimensions. Whereas when you're out on the street, you're in the public, you're having to think and be distracted by all of the things that are going on around you. So if you are going to do your surveys, do them all at home or all out on the street. Do it in a way so that the responses can be as similar to each other as possible. Make sense? So similarly, when we'll get into sampling in just a moment, use the same kind of sampling selection protocol as possible. So choosing which participant to talk to and approach and ask if they would be interested in participating in your study. Try to do that selection protocol as similar across interviewers as possible, if not identical. Okay, and also periodically, maybe at the end of each day, and certainly early on in the survey process, have the interviewers interview each other, have the ducks interview each other ducks, because you can make certain that people's approaches are standardized that way, so that there's a commonality among everyone there. Okay, so again, we're trying to get consistency across interviewers. And ideally, we don't have one person go to one community, a second person go to a second community, and a third person go to a third community, and then each of them do all of the interviews in those three communities. Why do you think that this could be problematic from an experimental design perspective? Keep in mind that each community may be very different from each other. But if you have a lack of consistency across interviewers and there's small things that creep in, maybe you have a young woman in one community being the interviewer, an older man in another community, and a young man in a third community doing the interviews. How people respond to those gender and age differences could be really significant. So ideally, in that situation where we have three communities and three interviewers, ideally, each interviewer would do a third of the surveys in each of the three communities. So the young woman does in community 1, and then does the same number in community 2, and then does the same number in community 3. The older man does the same number in community 2 as they do in community 1, as in community 3, and the same thing with a third person. The benefit for this is that you're not going to have as strong of an interviewer bias, which does happen. We do get interviewer biases. Okay? So if we can be consistent across our interviewers, if everyone follows the same protocols, has the same selection protocols, uses a word-for-word script, is very clear and direct in things, we have interviewers having standardized approaches, and they split up the communities so that each of them do some in all of the communities that we need to interview. If we do all of that, then it's most likely that our data will be comparable between the communities and between the interviewers. Not always, but it makes it more likely that it will. Okay. Last thing in this process, using appropriate surveyors. This is more intuitive, I think, than most of us may initially feel. I am an older white man from North America. Me coming into a poor community in Johannesburg, in a township, say, would not be the best person to do the survey, because I am very different from everyone there. I am not blending in. I do not know the cultural cues. I am from a different country, a different continent, let alone a different ethnic group. So there are things that I'm going to miss and things that the participants won't tell me as a extreme outsider from that community. I would be a very bad surveyor in that setting. I would be the wrong person to have in there, inappropriate surveyor. Similarly, we need to be mindful of our gender. If it's unusual for, say, a young woman to interview a tribal elder, maybe don't have young women doing the interviews, and certainly not of the tribal elders. So we need to be thinking of what works best. Similarly, having men interview housekeepers, women who work out of the house, may not be the best combination as well, right? So we want to make certain that there's some kind of matching of the participants with the surveyors, so that the surveyors and the participants are relatively comparable to each other in ethnicity, in gender, in age, in how they dress, as we talked about earlier, and also how they behave. All right. So all of these things together, along with a good training program, getting all surveyors up to speed and using standardized protocols, will help us to address and minimize those impacts of the limitations on self-report data, which is what a survey is self-report data, people telling you their own thoughts and feelings. Okay, so again, those 5 tools, let me go up to the top here, of appreciation, separation, objectivity, consistency across interviewers, standardizing protocols, approaches, and surveyors working across different places, and using appropriate surveyors that are well-trained and appropriate for those communities is a series of best practices that will help us get around that problem of the limitations of self-report data. Promise. There's lots of data that I can share with you as well if you'd like to know, but lots of research articles that talk about this. But this is a great set of tools for addressing those problems. Okay, so we've talked about the survey, making the survey great, having an intro script, having a approach protocol, having and choosing the proper surveyors or interviewers, and the protocols that those surveyors should use. Throughout this whole process, we've been assuming that we know what we're doing in terms of sampling from the community, from the population, right? So now we're going to spend some time, maybe 20 minutes or so, on talking about sampling, because sampling is really important. And using the proper sampling design will help improve the generalizability of our data to the larger population. So what do I mean by that? So if we think of marbles in a jar, sort of being equivalent to all of the people in a community that we want to survey. Okay, so each marble in the jar is a person in the community. Maybe the men are the blues and the women are the red marbles. Okay, so we want to be able to have the certainty that we have gone into that jar. If we take the lid off and we reach into the jar and we pull out a set of marbles that represent people in the community that are randomly selected from that community or randomly selected from the jar. Okay, because that population is so large, there's maybe several thousand marbles in that jar. That's too many people to be able to survey given our resources, right? Because what we typically do is we subsample from within the larger population. We don't talk to every single person in the community when we do a survey. That would take forever. It would give us a ton of data that would take forever to collect and then input and then analyze and summarize and figure out what it means. That's a lot of time. So typically what we do is we subsample. We select a couple of the marbles out, as I was talking about earlier. And those people, equating with those marbles, are our sample. So a sample is a portion of the population. And if we sample correctly, if we have our sampling design done correctly, we will randomly choose people from that population that have attitudes that represent all of the attitudes of the whole community, right? Or at least enough close to all of the attitudes of the community that we can generalize from the data that we get. Okay, so we're trying to come up with a sample because we can't survey everyone in the population. But say we get a lot of money, the government gives us a gigantic loan, and we have more money than we know what to do with. And we really do have the time and the money to be able to pay for researchers to go out and survey and talk to every single person in the community. In that case, we have talked to the entire population, and that is called a census, right? So every 10 years in the United States, and I know it's intermittent and varies from country to country, but every set amount of time, the government goes through and tries to count and characterize every single person in the country. That is called a census. If the government were to instead just go through and select a portion of the population, they would be taking a sample. Okay, so when we talk about sampling, that is what we're doing. And in social science research, almost never do we have the capability of doing a census. So typically what we do is we sample from the larger population. So this is much more common for what we do than the census. So when we talk about sampling design, this making certain that we've chosen the proper people to be in the sample is sampling design. Okay, so ideally we randomly select from the population. We have a representative sample from the population. That's the ideal. Very often we fail. Almost always we will fail. And what are those fails? What are the things that could stop us from having a truly representative sample? Instead, us receiving a non-representative sample, or also called a biased sample. Well, we may only go to those people when we're out doing the surveys that seem friendly and comfortable to talk to. Very happy people who just graduated from, say, secondary school or college or whatever, what have you. So if we do that, of course, we are not going to have the perspectives of the people who might be angry or not feeling well or resent the thing that we are asking them about, what have you. So we need to be making certain that we are randomly selecting from the population so that we are not only talking to the friendly people. We're not only talking to our friends. We're not only talking to our family. Those are biased samples. Okay. Similarly, if we have a situation where we are only surveying people with an online survey, right? An online survey, like SurveyMonkey is a common one that a lot of people use for online surveys. So if we were to only use SurveyMonkey to try to understand how farmers feel about human-wildlife conflict, we're going to get a very biased sample because there are going to be some older farmers who maybe are the majority of the farmers in your community. And those folks don't even use a smartphone that would have the ability to do a SurveyMonkey survey online, let alone have a laptop or a desktop computer. So if we use that, it's going to be particularly challenging. Similarly, if we are on Facebook and we put an online poll out and we ask people what they think, and we allow them to self-select, and people who maybe are friends with us, again, the friend bias, or people who like the same kinds of things that we do, this would be a bias of a different sort. And they're the only ones who find out about the polls and therefore are the only ones who do it, you're not going to get any information from people who may disagree with you. And so therefore, your sample is not going to be representative possibly for the larger audience, the larger population. Okay. Similarly, depending upon where you post the poll, say you only go to grocery stores and you talk to people in markets there to ask them their perspectives on what have you, whatever it is. Anyone who might, say, grow their own food at home would never see that poll, or have someone else do the shopping, their grocery shopping for them because they can't get out of the house because they're older and wheelchair bound or something. They are not going to be exposed to the poll. Right? So we need to think about how we sample our population, sample from within our population in a way that would access all of those people. The farmers who don't use online surveys, the people who maybe don't typically get out of the house, people who are not our friends, people who don't necessarily think the same as us, because we want to know what is the perspective of that population. And if we don't get the whole population, we're not going to have a representative sample, or not the whole population. If we don't get a sample that allows us to sample from across the whole population, we will not have a representative sample. It's a little circular, but you see what I mean. Okay. Unfortunately, sometimes this is the only way we can collect data. And when that's the case, we just acknowledge that that's the case and we move forward. We point out the limitations in our study, in our data analysis, and there are some ways that we can actually analyze the data in a way that helps to minimize that bias. Okay. So sampling error is a measurement of the non-randomness of our population, a bias of our surveys, right? So if you can think that there is a truth about what the entire population thinks of, right? The randomness from the population. If we were to census the entire population, this is what the truth is, their perspective on human-wildlife conflicts. But if we have a very small sample size, we might only talk to, just by chance, even if we're randomly selecting people, we might only be talking to those people who agree with us, or who disagree with us, or who are friends, or who are family. So if we have a small sample size, that tends to lead to greater sampling error, non-representativeness of your data for the larger population. So to that end, more samples are usually better. So this is a sample, or a graph here, that shows the margin of error on the x-axis, the vertical axis, the one that goes up and down, from 0% to 10%. And this is just a theoretical model. And across the on the y-axis, the margin of error is being shown. And on the x-axis, the sample size. So you can see that on this sample size, when we go from 0 to, say, 200 people that we speak to, this margin of error cuts almost in half. 300, it's less than in half. So when we talk to enough people, we are really reducing the sampling error, reduce the margin of error, and increase the representativeness of our sample of the whole of the population. So when people ask me, what's the best sample size? I always say more than what you have. Because that's the truth. We always need more than what we have. So we want to always get as much data as we can. This pie chart on the screen is a nice way to show that a sample is a subsection of the larger population. So the size of this pie chart, the size of this pie slice, is the size of our sample. More is always better. And it's better to always have more than you think you have, because with more samples, you have a better representativeness of your data, you have better sample power and statistical power, you have lower margins of errors and sample errors, and your estimate is more accurate. So as opposed to that earlier theoretical model, which had sample sizes of upwards of 300, almost never do sample do social sciences get up that high. Sometimes they do. But typically, you know, if you have 30 is a very basic minimum, smallest sample size that I would feel comfortable with in almost any study. But really it depends on the size of the population. If you have a population that is the size of your entire country, you're going to need to be a whole lot more than 30. You're going to have to be like maybe 3,000, 4,000, 6,000, 30,000, right? A lot of people. So sample size is scaled to the population size, typically. And the clarity of the signal, how much everybody tends to agree in that population. If you have a population that thinks a great diversity of thoughts, then you're going to need to have a larger sample size. All right? So how to know exactly what the sample size is? Well, there's this great program called G-Power that's available for free online. This is the website. It's a German program that you can download for free, and it's great. It tells you how many people you need to talk to make certain that you get enough samples to reduce the two main errors that we get in statistical analysis, right? Type 1 and type 2 errors, which are shown on here by beta and alpha. So it's a great program. Download it. It will tell you how many people you need to have that statistical strength. Okay, and in it you can see as you see on here, if you know the effect size, how strong and how unified the community is in their thoughts. Maybe you know that from your pilot data. Maybe you know that from earlier data collection in that community. You can put in that effect size and the error that you're comfortable with. Almost always that's 0.05, and how many groups you're going to be comparing, men versus women. That would be 2 groups. How many measurements you're going to have, how many different items you're going to have in the survey, and so on. So these are great ways to be able to make it possible for you to estimate the sample size. Check out G-Power. It's a good program. It's very useful, and it will help improve the sample size estimates that you think you might need. It's a great program. Okay, so if we want to have a representative sampling from our larger population, there are many ways to go about it, and I'm going to talk through a couple different possibilities here. We'll talk about simple random, systematic, cluster sampling, and stratified sampling, and then we'll have a couple others that we'll speak of really quickly at the end. First one, simple or random sampling. This is the best one. This is really what we want. And in this one, we are truly randomly taking the marbles from the jar. We are randomly choosing people across a landscape, choosing households across the landscape. Some typical ways we could go about this is that if we have a bunch of people in, say, an auditorium, and we want to interview a certain number of people, we give out tickets to everyone who comes in. Numbers are randomly drawn. Those people are entered into the survey, and we randomly choose from the tickets the people that we want to interview. Right? The people who tickets are pulled, maybe they get some small incentive, and then they're interviewed. Okay. Another way to go about it is that, as I had said at the beginning of this, maybe you have a map that shows all of the homes across a landscape. And on that map, you want to be able to choose households to speak to the major, the women in the community, or the head of households in each community, whoever it is that you would like to speak to. Well, you could number each of the households and then randomly choose numbers using a random number generator that would enable you to choose what house you're going to go and try to talk to. And you talk to them in the order that the random numbers were chosen until you get to the sample size that you're trying to get to. Pretty simple, right? So it is possible to do simple random sampling where we are truly randomizing the community. That really is possible. So think about whether you could do this in your community. Could you randomly choose from across your community? Is there a way that you can identify the people that you are targeting, the people that you are trying to speak to, in a way that would enable you to randomly choose who you speak to? So pause the video here for just a moment and see if you could do representative, simple, random sampling. Okay, so were you able to? Is there a way that you can? If not, think a bit more. Maybe you can come up with some. Maybe you can't. Maybe it's just not possible. And that's fine. This is the best way. If you can do simple random sampling to choose the people that you're going to survey, that is the best. If that's not possible, there are other choices. So we'll go to the next one, which is cluster or multi-stage sampling. In this case, we take people, say there's a very great number of houses in the landscape, way too many for us to be able to really choose. Or there are lots of people selling in stalls in the marketplace, and we want to try to talk to people there. So instead, we cluster participants by group and then choose the subsets from within each of the groups. And this is very useful if we're trying to make certain that we have, say, equal male and female, or equal older, middle-aged, and younger people in our survey, or rural and urban, or what have you, right? So if you have people in a landscape, houses are all over the place, and you want to make certain that you get an equal representation of people in the rural communities and people in the urban communities, you could choose those in those chosen groups and say, okay, rural communities, we select from within those, we're going to sample 30 different households up here, and in rural urban communities, or say 100 households up here, and in urban communities, we're going to choose 100 households here randomly chosen. And then we randomly choose from within all the households in the urban, randomly choose from all the households across the rural area. You'll probably be driving a lot more there. That way, you can make certain that you're choosing people equally across those two landscapes, as opposed to taking a large map and you just randomly choose houses from the rural to the urban interface. In which case, if you were to do that, you may just randomly end up with mostly urban, mostly rural. But if you want to make certain to be able to differentiate the rural from the urban, or choosing men from women, if there's a way to take the population list and choose randomly people in there, all men, all women, similar numbers, and go through and talk to them in that sequence. This is a good way to come up with what we call cluster sampling. And similarly, you can do a approach called multi-stage sampling, where we randomly sample participants in the groups and then put them in until we have enough people in each category. So as opposed to doing that first separation of taking all the participants in the cluster, and we choose and interview every single person from those clusters, and in the multi-stage sampling, we're taking that random sample and speaking to everybody there. Or I'm sorry, we're choosing a subset, a random subset of people in those two communities. So with cluster, let me restate this, we are choosing and speaking to everyone in the two chosen groups, the two clusters. But in multi-stage, we're making the clusters and then subsampling from within each of those clusters. You could see why one may be better than the other. In the cluster analysis, you might be able to survey the whole population, maybe do almost a census. But if your populations are so large and you need to be able to subselect from within them, you get into the multi-stage sampling. And that is very helpful as well. So take a moment, think about your places. Are there ways where you're working that you could do the cluster sampling, where you're choosing everybody in the chosen groups? Or if you're doing multi-stage, where you take the two groups and then you randomly select within it. Are there places that you could do either the cluster or the multi-stage as an approach? Okay, pause the video and try that out. Okay, was that useful? You can see why this is similar to the random selection. So it's still a pretty solid approach, but there are some biases because we're putting in the choices of the different clusters. So we are kind of arbitrarily, what is rural, what is urban, choosing a differentiation to make those two clusters. All right, so we're introducing a bit of our own biases as researchers in this process. Okay, third one, stratified sampling. Stratified is when particularly useful for gender differences. If we're interested in gender differences, age differences, and so on, we want to have, say, an equal variety of, or equal choices, number of people representing older community members, middle-aged community members, and younger community members. So in this one, we're stratifying, not within a cluster, which would be a multi-stage, but we're stratifying first and only by age. So we say we have a roster of people in the community. We know everybody in the community because they did the census there. So we talk to the people who keep the census, and we take people who are, say, 50 and older, 50 to 20 or 50 to 25, say, and then 25 to younger than that. Maybe 18, 15, whatever is defined as adult in that community. And we break it into those three groups. And then we randomly choose people within the older groups, within the younger group, and the middle-aged group. Same number in each of the three groups. That way we can ensure that we are representing the perspective and wisdom of the older people, of the elders in the community, the gaining experience of the middle-aged people, and then the idealism and innovativeness of the youth. Okay? This is stratified sampling. It's particularly useful for age and also for gender too. So pick a particular demographic category that is a major interest point for you, come up with a stratified sampling approach that may be representative or useful for your study, maybe not, but think about a way that it could possibly be useful. Could you use stratified sampling? Freeze the video, pause the video, and we'll get started in a moment. Okay, was that useful? Typically, stratified sampling is really useful, really helpful for people. Okay, next one is our upper right quadrant here, systematic oversampling. Now, say in this case, we would want to make certain that that the elderly in a population are representatively sampled, because we have gone through and we've done a stratified sampling, separating them out by demographics, by age, into those three different groups. But there is a very few people in the community that we're working with that are older than 50 for whatever reason. Maybe they move to another area to retire. Maybe there's a high mortality rate among the elderly because of some disease, so on. And so in that case, we would want to be able to make certain that we get all of them well represented in the community. So typically we have to oversample. So in this case, we want to make certain that it's more than just a random number, a random percentage. We oversample. Maybe we need to do a census of every single elderly person in the community to make certain that they are as well represented as the middle-aged and as the younger people in the community. And then once we do that, because we have so oversampled in our elderly population, we need to downweight their results numerically. And we'll get into this a little bit when we get into the quantitative sampling or quantitative data analysis in 2 sessions. Because what this does is this allows us to make their representativeness in the population numerically represented through the downweighting. So if there's an equal number of very young and middle-aged people, and there's only half of the number of people who are elderly, we would sample every single person in the elderly population, but then their representation in the overall mix, when we bring everybody together, would be cut in half. because they are not as strongly represented in the larger population. That's downweighting. Okay? Because we have oversampled in the elderly population in our hypothetical example here, we need to downweight their data when we combine all the data together by the degree to which they were oversampled. Okay? So systematic sampling is different from oversampling, but it is very commonly used. In this one, we're choosing every certain number of people to talk to. When we're doing social science surveys out on the street, this is one we use all the time because it's a way to introduce some degree of randomness into our selection protocol where we are not talking to every single person who comes down the street. We think of a line of people walking just constantly by. We talk to the first person and we ask them, excuse me, sir or ma'am, my name is James Danoff-Burg, I'm with the Living Desert. We do our intro script. We ask them to participate. If they say yes, we do the survey. If not, if they don't want to participate, we let them go. But then we count a certain number of people off, maybe every third person. So they say, thank you for asking, but I'd rather not spend the time. So they leave. One person passes, a second person passes, and then the third person that comes down after they leave, we ask them, excuse me, miss, my name is blah, blah, blah. Would you be interested in participating in this survey? If they say yes, then you survey them, and so on, right? Typically, most researchers use, at a minimum, every third person that comes through, or every third party. And then we speak to the party and ask if anybody in the party would be interested in participating. The benefit of only introducing the survey to one person in a larger party is that you're again trying to reduce the bias of oversampling from within that group, because people who tend to hang out together, who walk down the street together, they tend to be more similar to each other than to the community at large. So if we were to ask every single person in a group of 10 people, we would have 10 perspectives that are very similar to each other, right? So typically in systematic sampling, one that we use all the time in social science surveys, so underline this one, is that we choose every third person or every third party, and we ask that party or that person if one of them would be willing to be interviewed by us for our survey. That's systematic sampling. So it's relevant to, similar to oversampling in that we're trying to numerically correct for the number of people in a group. That's why they're often put together. Okay, so oversampling, trying to get the perspectives of a key demographic that is underrepresented. Systematic sampling, very commonly used out on the street to help us choose a certain number of people to randomly select and interview. Okay, so take a moment, freeze the video, and think about whether this could be useful for you. Okay, systematic sampling, very helpful. There are a series of other non-representative sampling methods that are biased by their approach. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I am going to talk about a few of them in particular. Convenience sampling is when we just kind of talk to whoever's around. We're at a bar and we talk to the people around us. This is very biased because, very flawed, because it's going to produce people who often think like you or often think similar to each other because they happen to be around where you are. You go to a family reunion and interview your family. Your family is not representative of the larger community necessarily, right? So try to avoid convenience sampling, even though sometimes we have to use it because that's the only way we can get the data. So similarly, snowball is often used and is a valuable approach where we are trying to get at a community of people that are hard to identify. So we want to only speak to people who are housekeepers, people who clean other people's houses. So we go up to a housekeeper and we ask them if they would be willing to interview. We survey them. And then we ask them for the names of 2 other people who also are housekeepers who they could recommend us to speak to, and if they have their contact information. We go and we talk to those 2 people. They're willing to be interviewed, so we interview them. They give us 2 names. We talk to 2 more. This is called the snowball approach, because in cold climates where there is snow, of course, if you start a snowball at the top of a hill and let it roll downhill, it picks up snow as it gets down, and it gets progressively bigger and bigger and bigger. If you've never seen a snowball do that, this may not make sense to you, but snowball sampling is one that we use quite a bit that is very useful. Okay, for specific groups. Okay, so the best, random sampling. Think if you can set up that random sampling through the tickets, through randomly choosing houses and so on. Next best is the stratified, or cluster, or multi-stage, which are very helpful. If we can't do those, if we have to be out on the street, systematic sampling is very commonly used. It's a little flawed, but it's still useful. If we need to target specific undersampled groups, we do our oversampling if we're trying to get our older people to have their representation in the sample. Convenience is certainly the easiest. Convenience sampling, where we just sort of ask whoever's around us at the time, as many of them as we can get. But it's also incredibly flawed. Also easy is snowball, but snowball sampling, as biased of a sampling as it is, can be really useful if we're trying to gain access to cohesive communities, like what I was saying with the housekeepers. Okay, so we have this series of summaries of different approaches. What I'd like you to do is think about your survey now and your research approach, and think about which of these that we've already gone through, all of them, which is most useful for you. Which do you want to use to collect your data? Okay, pause the video, think about it for a moment, and then come on back, write down the sampling method that you want to use. Okay, so continuing on, hopefully you found a good one that works well for you. Hopefully it's random sampling. If not, think about the biases that will be introduced by whatever method that you used, or the benefits of using whatever method that you use. Okay, and be able to justify that. So when we're talking about planning a survey protocol, planning is always challenging because it's going to be changed. We come up with the best plan, and we get out into the field, and we figure out that we're going to have to change that plan somewhat because what we had expected to be possible is not. So this is from the Kellogg Foundation, which is a granting agency in the United States, quote that I like a lot. Keep your research design simple, and we could say sampling design, simple, flexible, and responsive to the changing needs of the project. We might have a way that we think we could do simple sampling, simple random sampling, but maybe we need to do more systematic or snowball sampling. As long as we have good, adequate justifications for it and our understanding of the limitations of those sampling, we're good. So what I'd like you to do now is to take what we did, what we've already talked through, all the notes that you've taken already, compile them together. Design a draft survey protocol, figure out who you're surveying, where are you going to survey, how can you get a representative sample, what sampling method are you going to use, are there things that you can do to improve or approximate random or simple sampling, simple random sampling. How long are you going to sample in a day and over the entire sampling period? How are you going to staff it? What are the limitations of your approach? And is there anything you can do to address those limitations? Okay, take a moment. This is going to be a larger one, a longer one to do. Pause the video and see if you can elaborate on your sampling protocol. Okay, and we're back. So, congratulations. This is a big deal, putting together a sampling protocol. If you can have a well-justified sampling method and a solid approach and a good, insightful reason for why you're doing that, and a justification for why, and an understanding of the limitations of it, who's going to survey, how you're going to sample, what is the most culturally appropriate way to go, how are you going to be appreciative, objective, separate, standardize your sampling protocol, standardize your sampling and interviewing methods, you're going to win. So if you can do this, you are going to make it happen. Once you have your protocol together, get together with a friend, share your approaches, share your protocols, give each other some suggestions. Think about the audience, think about the sampling methods, think about the location, the duration of sampling. Can you improve or approximate randomness to make it more likely that you will get a representative sample to figure out what the true set of opinions are in your community? All right. So this is a longer term thing. You don't have to pause the slide for this, but find someone else. Once you have your research protocol together, share your protocols, share why you're doing what you're doing, see if you can help each other figure out how to make this better. All right. So once you have done that and you've finished your sampling protocol, incorporate these revisions from your friend into your written protocol, make things great, create your protocol, and then next week, we're going to talk about how to deal with the data that you are going to get in huge amounts. Because you have such great research designs and an excellent survey protocol put together, an amazing survey, of course, and a great approach. How are we going to deal with all that data? How are we going to manage it? How are we going to get it into a format that we can actually analyze it? How to go forward. So thanks for doing all you do. And thanks for making communities matter for conservation, because really they are crucial for us to succeed as conservationists. So I'm going to stop the share here. Wish you all a happy day, evening, morning, whenever it is that you happen to be watching this. We look forward to continuing to work with you in the next few weeks. Congratulations, you're halfway through the program. This is very exciting, right? Over halfway, actually. 6 of 11. Take care of yourselves. Thanks for being a part of things. Dr. James Danoff-Burg from the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens.